Now then, I broke the data down. By the way, notice that this jihad in the religion of peace is relentless. It's against Kafirs and impure Muslims. Jihad adapts, but it does not change. It is a constant doctrine. Our next slide, we have the jihad attacks per year, and I just chose 4 countries. I didn't want to choose them all. So here we have Israel, India, Thailand, and the Philippines. But this is not useful to us because Israel's small, India's very large. So what we need on our next slide is per capita. Israel is the most. How many people here knew there was intense jihad in Thailand? Did you know that? In the Philippines, it's mostly killing Christian Catholics. And in India, of course, it's killing Hindus. Now I want to read this in a different way. Jew, Buddhist, Christian, and Hindu. Jihad is against the Jews, the Buddhists. And by the way, in Europe, there are many secularists who say, well, all right, they're killing Christians. What do I care? Anyway, I don't like Christians anyway. Do you know that Islam despises an atheist more than they do a Christian or a Jew? So it's against the secularist as well. Don't think that if there's jihad, you say, oh, I don't believe in God. Ooh, that's worse than believing in Jehovah. Next slide. It all follows a doctrine. And by the way, in America, George Bush, the Republican president, said after the 9/11 attack, Islam is the religion of peace. Now, I went through all of this 1,400 years, and I found that there were 12 decades without jihad. So we can say that Islam is the religion of peace, 9%. Now, I've been a college professor, and if you come to me and take a test, and you get 9% on the test, you get an F in the course. I give George Bush an F in my course. Seriously. On our next slide, this constant violence is normal. We have to ask ourselves, why does it never stop? Something is driving it. Does that make sense to you? For 1,400 years, it's never changed except in technology. So therefore, there's something constant that's driving it. What is the pole star? Well, the pole star on our next slide is jihad, but we need to stop and see where do we find jihad. Most people think that Islam is found in the Quran. Is that not a common understanding? But Islam, Allah is the least of Islam. Muhammad is recorded in 2 sets of text, the Sirah, his biography, and the Hadith, which are his traditions. The shortest tradition is, war is deceit. These are all things that Muhammad said and did, and that's the shortest one. Some of them go for as much as a page, but most of them are a short paragraph. They are the reported, what Muhammad said and did. Why do we care what Muhammad said and did? Because there are 93 verses in the Quran which say, do as Muhammad did, speak as Muhammad spoke. Muhammad is the perfect Muslim. Muhammad is the divine human prototype. Allah wants every Muslim to be Muhammad. So therefore, we can say that Islam is 14% Allah and 86% Muhammad. That's an insight right there. By the way, do you notice my constant use of numbers here? You don't believe this? Do it yourself. This is not an opinion. This can be reproduced. All right, so we have, this is the total doctrine. And now then, here's an interesting part. You think that Islamic doctrine is about Muslims. I'll bet most people do. Not so. It's mostly about you and me. So you may not know it, but you're in the Quran. Nearly 2/3 of the Quran is about the infidel. 81% of Muhammad's life is devoted to the infidel, the kafir. And then only 37% is in the hadith. So over half, I call this the trilogy, Quran, Sirah, Hadith. And over half of it is devoted to you and me. Now then, you've probably heard that there's a verse or two in the Quran about jihad. Just a little bit. Now we need to see something here. This is the beginning of the concept of dualism. How much jihad was there in Mecca? Oops, let's stop. You've heard of the Quran, right? There's not a Quran. There are 2 Qurans. An early Quran and a latter Quran. The early was in Mecca, the latter was in Medina. Now the Quran written in Mecca has no jihad. Hence, it is peaceful. The jihad in Medina is 24%. Now let me ask you this question. Is Islam the religion of peace? According to Mecca, yes it is. But according to Medina, 24% of it is about jihad. Look how much of Muhammad's biography, 2/3 of it is about jihad. And the Sirah, or the Hadith, is only 21%. So nearly 1/3 of the trilogy of Islam is devoted to jihad. And on our next slide, this is fascinating to me, but I've been a businessman. And I'm interested in sales. I'm interested in, is it improving or not? Here's some little known facts. I love facts. Muhammad preached the religion of Islam for 13 years in Mecca. He converted 150. 150. That's about 10 a year. If he had kept on preaching the religion of Islam until he died, there would have been fewer than 1,000 Muslims, and Islam would have ceased to exist. But when he moved to Medina, he became a politician and a warlord, a jihadist. And look what happened. When he died, every Arab was a Muslim. Remember, he averaged an event of violence on the average of every 6 weeks for the last 9 years of his life. That was successful. The religion didn't work, but the politics of jihad worked incredibly well. But there's also something here. When Islam introduces itself, it's peaceful. Do you know what begins the jihad? Immigration. That's exactly what the history of Muhammad says. Jihad begins with immigration. I am not making this up. I think this is fascinating, but it also creates a question. How come nobody ever sat down and did this? Here's the reason why. Up to now, the study of Islam has been with Orientalists, that is, people who study the Middle East, Arabists, specialists in the Arabic language, and theologians and historians. I'm, to my knowledge, the first scientist who ever studied the Islamic text. So I was the first scientist there. So all of this work, in a sense, was easy. What follows is harder. On our next slide, we have something else. This is called the law of Islamic saturation. I have plotted the growth of Islam. I plotted the growth of Islam in Arabia. I've now plotted the growth of Islam in many Arab and many Muslim nations. Here we see Turkey. In the year 1300, when Islam invaded, Turkey was called Asia Minor. It was called Anatolia, and it was Christian. All Christian. Now notice something here. It's now 99.7% Muslim and only 0.3% Christian. Look at the time scale on the bottom. Centuries. Centuries. Islam is never in a hurry because it has a constant doctrine which will be repeated from generation to generation. So there's no need to worry. It will all happen in time. Now the shapes of these curves differ from Lebanon. For instance, Lebanon was a Christian nation before the Second World War. It's now primarily Islamic. Do you know why? Because the Christians, out of their compassion, admitted the Palestinian immigrants. It begins with immigration. I call it the law of Islamic saturation. It will not cease in Turkey until the last Christian is gone. On our next slide, I'm also the first person who ever asked this question. How many have died in jihad? Is this a reasonable question? Yes, it is. You can ask the question, how many died under Stalin? How many died under Mao Zedong? How many died under Pol Pot? How many died under Hitler? These are numbers that are well known. No one has ever asked the question, how many have died in 1400 years? The answer is 10 million Buddhists, 80 million Hindus, 60 million Christians, and 120 million Africans. The Africans' death was as the result of slavery. It is Islam that drove the slave trade in Africa. Every black African who came from Africa to America as a slave was sold to the white man on the wooden ship by a Muslim slave trader, and they were taken from slave pens. It was a business deal. There were invoices, there were bills of sale, there were inventories. Now let me tell you a little bit about the process of classically collecting slaves. And I have spoken with Africans who were slaves under Islam. They come into the town and they kill those who can defend. Then they capture those who will be available to be made to work. What happens to the children and the babies? They're left behind. What happens to the weak, the crippled, and the old? They're left behind. What happens after all the people who can work and do things? They die of attrition. Then they also die on the forced march. Livingstone interviewed Islamic slave traders and said, "Why do you do this?" They said, "It is our religion." But they said, there's something peculiar about this. Many of the slaves die of what they called a disease of the heart. That is, they became so depressed that they simply died. Okay. On our next slide, I maintain that doctrine drives history and that history shows the true nature of political Islam. Oops, I never explained to you what political Islam is. Let me say this. I have absolutely no interest in the religion of Islam. The religion of Islam is preached in Mecca, and it's concerned with a Muslim avoiding hell and going to paradise. That is the religion. Political Islam is what affects me. 9/11, the destruction of the World Trade Towers, was a political action with a religious motivation, but the act itself was political. Political Islam is the nature of all Kafir countries, and it is permanent and it is unchangeable. Now, some people say, Islam just needs to reform. Let me tell you what the doctrine of Islam is. The Quran is perfect, it is eternal, and it is universal. Now, let me ask you a question. How do you take a doctrine that's perfect and eternal and change it? Because if you take something out, then it's no longer perfect. And if it's perfect, you can't add anything to it. Does this make sense? So, there is no such thing as moderating Islam. Now, a Muslim may be moderate in the sense that he doesn't practice all of Islam. By the way, do you notice something here? Am I talking about Muslims? I'm talking about doctrine and history. I never talk about Muslims. On our next slide, we have looking at our own intellectual history. Why is this news to you? Why isn't this common knowledge? There's something very peculiar as you read all the historical doctrine. When Islam came out of Arabia, it was the Saracens and the Arabs. When Islam invaded from Turkey, what was it? Were they Muslims? No, they were Turks. When they invaded Spain, were they Muslims? No, they were Moors. And in England today, for instance, the Muslims are called Asian. There's something to be known here in psychology. We do not want to name those who are persecuting. Here's something else. In America, those who know about Islam are apologists for Islam. And when you see the courses they took in college, you'll understand why. They don't study the primary doctrine. They study comments by Muslims about the doctrine. It's very different when you study the root cause. And I, by the way, have very little use for secondary sources. What I want to use are primary sources, not secondary. And all the establishment specialists are apologists for Islam. The head of the Islamic Studies Department at Vanderbilt University is an apologist for Islam. It's only those outside the establishment who are critics of Islam. And I'm not really a critic of Islam. Think back what I've been telling you. Have I ever said it was wrong? That they shouldn't have done that? I've simply described what happened and why. On our next slide, I have a question for you. I sell a Quran which any person can pick up and read. Why did it take 1,400 years for this to happen? I'll tell you why. I know some of these scholars in universities. They want to be very smart. They are elites in their own way. They don't want to make it easy. Besides, they weren't taught it was easy anyway. They expected the Quran to be confusing and almost ununderstandable. So there's never even the thought, why do we make this readable? But why is it that it's waited this long? Why is it that in the schools in America, I don't know here, the Quran is not taught, Jihad is not taught, Muhammad isn't taught, the Hadith are not taught. And then in America, The sum of Islam is called the Golden Age, the high point of human history. Why do we remain ignorant and keep suffering? Now then, little story. After doing all this study, my wife, who works with me as well, she's my internet researcher, and also if you study this stuff, you need somebody to talk to. All right? So she gets to hear me talk a lot. Maybe most wives are, I don't know. But I was talking to her and I said, why is it we will not study this? Because I get a lot of pushback. Oh, you're a bigot, you're a hater, you're an Islamophobe. Why is that? I said, you know, it's like we're abused wives or sexually abused children. And she said, wait a minute. So my internet researcher went in the house and came back with a document from the YWCA, which is a women's organization. It was the rape and sexual abuse and wife beat, that's not the right word, but basically the manual on how to counsel women who've been sexually abused and beaten. So the next thing you're going to see is using this model to explain why we are who we are. On our next slide, now by the way, in America, it is not politically correct. Do y'all have political correctness here? Okay. It's not politically correct to criticize any minority. You'll be called a bigot. And then there's this element of you can actually be physically threatened. But that's this century. When we read history books, it existed before political correctness and multiculturalism. So we have to seek an answer. Now remember, I have described ongoing brutality. Our next slide we see what I call the traumatized mind. Kafirs accept violence and threats from Islam without protest. We deny the suffering caused by political Islam, and we accept political Sharia. Oh, you need Sharia? Fine. I'll describe political Sharia in the next lecture. The Rape and Sexual Abuse Manual says that violent molestation can create denial. I maintain that the Western mind is in the state of denial. Next slide. They deny there's even attack. If anyone has ever talked with women who are abused by their husbands, oh, no, no, no. Oh, occasionally, maybe a little, he did once. It's denial. Our media in the United States speaks very little of the jihad and never connects the dot. And this is tragic. The Christians never speak of the Christians being killed in Iraq, never speak of the Christians being killed in Nigeria, Sudan, and other areas. It is something you do not talk about. Denial. Fear. The fear is the tool that the abuser used to control the victim. Now this refers to, in America, there was something that was you know the Muhammad cartoons, okay? Why is there such an outrage? It creates fear. In America, people are physically afraid to say anything and do anything which they view would insult Islam. Why are facts insults? Facts are facts. On our next slide, we have guilt. We've not treated Islam in the right way. If we will only treat Islam better, all of this will go away. This violence is a result of our foreign policy in America. We have the wrong foreign policy. If we had the right foreign policy, everything would be good. If we treat the Muslims right, they'll treat us right. There's shame. They don't want this talked about. That's the reason in America this history is not taught at all. On our next slide, there's humiliation. How many Europeans like to brag about the fact their ancestors were slaves, sold into slavery in the Islamic world? This is not a subject we want to talk about. Anger turns inward. I can tell you this in America. After 9/11, American politics changed. It became far less reasonable. It became far more hateful. George Bush is an idiot. That is not political comment. That is not political comment. And he's not an idiot. You may not like his policies, but that is to start examining his policies is the beginning of critical thought. George Bush is an idiot. That's not critical thought. We assassinate character. With my lectures, I'm never challenged on their facts. I'm just told to be, does the term KKK mean anything to y'all here? I'm KKK, I'm a neo-Nazi, I'm a hater, I'm a bigot. No one ever says, That fact is not a fact. They say, I am an immoral person. On our next slide, we're very pessimistic. In America, there's a Great Depression about Islam. It goes like this. Well, what are we going to do? On our next slide, here's the abuser. The abuser, no wife beater ever says, man, I beat my bitch last night. No, they don't do that. They don't strike her, or if they did, she needed it. So there's not any sense talking about it. For instance, Turkey denies the Armenian genocide. There was no genocide. Oh, there were a few people killed, but that was because of some wars. So they deny it. And by the way, they're arrogant and overly confident. Islam is perfect. There's nothing wrong with Islam, and so therefore it cannot be criticized. On our next slide, domination. The word Islam means to submit. The abuser expects submission. When I deal with Muslims, and I do so in a quiet tone of voice, I never insult, I never anger, and I use facts. They're stunned. What? You do not submit? You do not apologize? You do not try to be nice? Really, I'm telling you, they're like, I can't believe that he will stand and talk. Because they expect submission. And then they want us to feel guilty. In America after 9/11, the Muslims said again and again, we are the true victims of the attack on 9/11. People say bad things about Islam. Somebody pointed their finger at my wife with her hijab in the checkout line. We are the victims. Here's what I maintain. After 1,400 years of jihad, brutality, enslavement, theft, deception, rape, annihilation, and insults, the Kafir mind has become that identical to that of the abused wife. But what's the solution? We must face our history. We must face our fears. And with that, I draw you to a close. Thank you.